Well, if blacks in the United States were excluded from roughly 90% of the territory by a variety of laws and administrative procedures, I would call it white supremacy. That's the way Israel has been since its origins. That's only one aspect. If there were large-scale funding in the United States for white settlements, development of white areas, but nothing for black settlements and black areas, I'd call it white supremacy. It's not the case that within Israel's own boundaries, it's not the case that Jewish Israelis, Jews and Palestinians are treated equally. And in fact, as you know, you can't even have Israeli citizenship. Can't have, there's no such thing as the High Court determined. You have to be Jewish or Palestinian. And if you're Palestinian, you're deprived of many rights in all sorts of ways. That's a form of Jewish supremacy, just as it would be white supremacy in the United States. In Gaza, it's just a monstrosity. Israel has destroyed Gaza. It barely survives. It's living under inconceivable conditions. It's literally almost unlivable. The West Bank, Palestinians are subjected to incredible interference and restrictions on their lives. That's Jewish supremacy. And the whole region is integrated. As in the last 50 years, since immediately after the 1967 war, Israel has been moving to develop greater Israel step by step, which incorporates whatever in the West Bank Israel wants to have within itself. New cities, Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Kedumim, others linked to Israel by major infrastructure projects, subsidized housing for Jews in the West Bank. You can live in a Jewish settlement in the West Bank and not even know there's any Arabs. You can take a superhighway to your job in Tel Aviv. If you're a Palestinian, you may be barred from your olive groves, your fields, by checkpoints, which are arbitrarily opened and manned. Probably about 150 or 160 of them by now. Call it whatever name you like, but certainly Jewish supremacy is about the weakest term you can use for it. So I don't see anything wrong with the term, but it's not much point debating terminology. It's the situation that exists that we have to face and be interested in doing something about it. It's an intolerable situation, certainly for Palestinians. It's very harmful for Jews. It was predictable and predicted in the 1970s that if Israel continued its policies of sacrificing security for expansion, that it would lead to moral degeneration within Israel, undermining of the status of the Jewish institutions, would turn Israel from a very admired state, as it was in the 70s, to a pariah state, as it is today. Predicted, predictable, all of these things have happened. For the Palestinians, it's been a terrible period, getting worse. So whatever name we like to give it, that's the situation, and we should be dedicated to overcoming it.
I definitely agree with the conclusions of being able to overcome it. However, I do think that there's a lot of context that was left out that is important to include in order to truly understand why we're in the situation and how we move out of it. And I think that certain conclusions I would probably disagree. I think the Oslo Accords are a huge failure. I'm against what happened in the Oslo Accords. Although I was born in that year, obviously I didn't have a position when I was 1 year old to be able to be against it. However, morally, I think it's immoral for both peoples to divide the land. I think in order to fulfill the aspirations of both populations, we need to create a reality where they both can live equally on one land that does not exclude anyone. When you said about the Arabs being excluded from, or the Palestinians, whatever they identify within Israel with Israeli citizenship, in the Declaration of Independence, it includes a state that would be equal, including the Arabs and the other communities, the Bedouin, the Druzim, the Assyrians, the Armenians, the other communities that exist within Israel. As Israelis, they're not only Jews, there are also Arabs. Also, in terms of settlements, I find this term usually very problematic because it tends to be applied only when it comes to new Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria, villages that are built on ancestral Jewish land for which you dig in the land and you find Jewish history. That definitely doesn't mean that Palestinians don't also have a connection and a valid connection to that land, but the Jews also have a connection. And so the new Jewish villages are considered settlements, but the new Palestinian villages are not considered settlements. I think that's applying a double standard in order to give the impression that Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria are somehow foreign, and the Jews are not foreign on their ancient homeland. Not only are those that came back home the descendants of an indigenous collective that did not lose their indigenous status or identity, culture, language, and so on, connection to a land, but also there was always a presence of Jews living in that land until many of them were displaced in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and were not allowed to come back. I'm against completely what is happening to the people in Gaza. I actually see Palestinians as my cousins, so I don't just see it as a human rights issue, I see it as a family issue. I'm against the status quo for which people cannot travel to different villages in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. I'm against the restrictions. I've stated clearly I'm against the wall. I understand why many people justify it. I'm definitely not saying that we need to remove it tomorrow, but we need to realize that this wall is unjust and that we need to remove it in order for people to be able to experience the land as whole. There are also restrictions. You claim that there are restrictions of Palestinians to be coming into Israel. Absolutely, because they're not Israeli citizens, which I'm against. But there are also restrictions of Israeli citizens to be able to go into Gaza or to be able to go into Area A that's controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and Area B is partially controlled by the Palestinian Authority as well. And as someone who has been, often in these areas, I see very often Palestinian Israeli or Arab Israeli vehicles going into Area A without a problem. The only issue is when they are Jewish Israelis. And many Jews without Israeli citizenship, who let's say had American citizenship, who wanted to go to certain very important places like Kevel Yosef, the tomb of Joseph in Nablus, or what Jews have always referred to as Shem, they were also removed even though they didn't have Israeli citizenship. So I think there's a restriction of movement and criticism to be had on both sides. And I'll definitely agree that I'm against the restriction of movement to the Palestinians, but I think it's important not to leave out the context that Jews are also being restricted from movement as well. I would disagree also of considering it Greater Israel. I would refer to as historic Israel, because we are the nation of Israel. We consider this land Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Judea and Samaria is the heartland of that region, what is today considered the West Bank. Jordan was also a part of the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judea. And I think to refer to Greater Israel would be to go more so in the region of Iraq, which I don't think anyone is pushing for or thinking of. And there's no practical actions I see of that happening or of anyone thinking in that way. So in terms of terminology, I would agree with you that this is the least important thing to focus on, and we should focus on moving forward. But I would also say that sometimes using the wrong terminology would create and does create division between peoples, because when a lot of people on the Israeli side hear certain things being said about them that may be based on many truths, but are projected in the wrong way that sort of demonizes or antagonizes them, it prevents them from being able to accept certain narratives that they're missing. And vice versa, if Palestinians are being antagonized and considered all sorts of things and context is being removed and they're being blamed for all the problems, I think it prevents Palestinians from also hearing the narratives that they're missing. And we tend to have the narrative correct when it comes about us, but tend to have it wrong when it comes to the other. So I do agree that the semantics and the terms are less important, but they are also important because at the end of the day, when we communicate, it's not just to prove a point, it's to be able to find a way for the other to understand what we mean and be able to move forward from there, which most likely to be able to move forward, we agree with. But I think a lot of people on the Israeli side probably oppose Noam's views. And it's not necessarily because of his morals or his conclusions, but sometimes because of certain words that he uses for which I am able to understand why you use those words and what you mean by them, but maybe other people may reject your greater ideas and morals that they may have agreed with just because certain terms are being used that make them feel antagonized. So I do think sometimes terminology is important in order to create a movement to bring people together.